Everybody.
That's why I was reluctant with my focus.
I think we're all set to resume with Tonia Tanner talking about her work on researching the farm and field size dynamics and type dynamics in this area and how we implemented that in Vision.
Okay, so my name is Tonia Tanner and Scott Mitchell is my graduate supervisor, and today we're going to talk about trends and transitions between farm types and in the spatial layout of farm fields. Okay, so what are we modeling? So we're interested in modeling future possible trends in the number of different types of farming operations, the size of farming operations, and field size. And the reason that we're interested in these particular variables are because they're indicators for farm management, land use intensity, and can be used as bioindicators for local diversity and ecosystem services. Including them in this scenario project allows us to recognize and incorporate the reality that the agricultural industry is changing. Farms aren't static through time, and this has implications for issues that are related to land management. So in this presentation, we're going to discuss what some of the present trends are in agriculture, touch on why they matter, and then dive into how we built a model that tries to incorporate some of these dynamics. Okay, so what are present trends in agriculture? So we know that Eastern Ontario is part of a larger national and global trend where we have fewer farms and they are larger than in the past. In Eastern Ontario, we're seeing an average loss of about 364 farms every 5 years and an average farm increase in size in between 5 and 9 hectares every 5 years. But what these figures don't tell us are what kinds of farms we're losing and where they are going to. So we looked at farm type and size trends using the agricultural census data. So on the left here, we have the 8 farm types that were developed by Ted Huffman of AFC, and then we have the 21 subcategories that we used in our modeling that were developed by Dan McDonald. And so essentially what we found by looking at the linear projections of the ag census data, we found that there are trends in farm size and in farm number over time. So what this is showing is that anything circled in red is indicating a decrease in the number of these types of farms. The green circle indicates that these farms are increasing in the number, and the green arrow indicates an increase in the average size of these farms. So the takeaway message is really just that the only farms that are expanding in both size and number are farms in the field crop category, and that only farms that have a field crop component are seeing any increase in average farm size. So what's driving farm size trends? So there are some economic drivers influencing farm size trends, so things like uneven accessibility to agricultural support programs that tend to benefit farms that are larger because they're more easily able to access them. Also, larger farms with greater capital investments are more easily able to acquire and farm more lands. There are also some market drivers, such as the volatility of market prices for agricultural products, specifically those that are involved with animal meat products. And these prices may encourage farmers to retire or drop that component of their operation. We're also seeing changes in the structure of farms, meaning that the actual amount of land in production isn't changing, but ownership really is. And where we see the most land being sold in farms are being bought by expanding operations, and that expansion can also be facilitated through the leasing of farmland. We also see advances in technology that allow more land to be farmed more quickly and by fewer people. So what's happening in terms of field sizes? So field sizes are growing. There hasn't been a lot of coverage of field size trends in the literature. What discussion there is indicates that field sizes, particularly for fields that are planted in cash crops, such as corn and soy, are growing in size. And here we have an example of changes in field size for corn in Iowa from 89 to 2011. And the tendency is that in 2011 we tend to see a lot fewer smaller fields. So we have more fields that are in this larger bin category. And the concern with this trend is that larger fields reduce the potential for greater crop diversity. They reduce the amount of non-crop habitat in the landscape. They tend to be associated with more intensive agricultural practices, such as increased inputs, and they have consequences for ecosystem services that are lost whenever we lose these non-crop boundaries. So one of the things that I wanted to do was try to address and quantify field size change in Eastern Ontario. The lack of coverage in field size trends in the literature motivated me to try to access this, and the work was important in itself because it was a baseline for what we might expect field size growth to look like within Eastern Ontario. So I worked off of a project called the Farmland Project using data from 2011 to 2012. And for 93 3x3 kilometer landscapes, I visually interpreted Landsat and Google Earth Time Series imagery comparing 2011 to 2012 and digitized the changes in field configurations. And for the most part, those changes were modest, but they were prevalent in all of the study sites. So here we have an example of the land configuration from 2012, and so there's a bunch of fields here. And then by 2015, all of those fields get amalgamated into one single field. And here's an example of what that consolidation looks like on the ground. So again, 2011, we've got a number of fields with an average field size of 1.8 hectares, and then, yep.
And Guelph on the phone, they're not hearing us. So,
Scott, we can hear now.
oh, great. Oh,
Thank you.
That's, all right, delayed message. All right, thanks, good.
By email.
Thank you.
So then in 2015, we see that these 10 fields become consolidated into one field with an average size now of 19.5 hectares. So what's driving field size trends? So there have been a lot of shifts in land management practices, which are trending towards smaller fields made more sense in the past, but many of the benefits that they offered in combination with their non-crop boundaries have been made obsolete by more intensive practices, so we just don't need some of the services they provide anymore because we have replacements. As well, because the services provided by non-crop boundaries are most effective when they're implemented systematically, if you start losing these boundaries throughout the landscape, the less effective their actual coverage becomes. So if one of your neighbors is taking down all of your hedgerows, your hedgerow may be less effective than it was in the past. Also, non-crop and semi-natural areas are seen as unproductive and even burdensome because they have to be managed and maintained. And also, the increased efficiency of farm machinery has shown that crops that have a longer length have a reduced associated harvest time. So bigger farms are easier to get out into to plant and also have a quicker harvest time. Okay, so we've developed what we call the farm model, which tackles the dynamics of farm expansion, transition, retirement, and field consolidation. And the first three components are very much driven by the trends that we pulled out of the census data, and the latter is an event that gets triggered by the first two components of the model, that being expansion and transition. So that was kind of one of the more dynamic or stochastic parts of the model, because we're not telling the model how many fields to consolidate. We're really relying on how many expansions and transitions happen. So I thought it might be important to mention how you can track specific farm events, again, those events being expansion, transition, or retirement, when you complete a run and envision. Much of the farm model reports internally, so it's a really invaluable resource. And a really invaluable resource that helps to sort out much of the specific events is an output file from Envision called the Farms Pivot Table, Farm Events Pivot Table. And so this table can tell you what events have occurred, with every event being a separate row here. So it can indicate the actual event that happened, the year that it happened. So in this table, events such as expansion are represented by the event name bought. Farms that are being bought by expanding farms are called sold. Any farms that are eliminated are referring to farms that have gone into retirement, so they're no longer active farms in the model. And then recovered farms refers to farms that are brought out of retirement, and that can be because they're transitioning to a different farm type, or maybe they're being bought by an expanding farm. And so this table was really important to use in conjunction with the IDU shapefile output that comes out annually, if you set it to come out annually, because then you can really look at specific events as they exist within the IDUs. Okay, so let's get into what farm expansion is, how it works, and what it looks like. So if we look back at our farm type tree, we can break down some of the trends in farm type and number and size into categories. So expanding farms, so we've categorized expanding farms and non-expanding farms. So an expanding farm is really just any farm that's growing in average farm size. This could mean that those farms are decreasing in number, so we have fewer of them, but they are larger, or that they could be increasing in number and size, so we have more of them and they are larger. So we can pick those up pretty easily within the chart here. So we use those relationships between the expanding and non-expanding farms to influence who it is that these expanded farms are buying within the model. Okay, so we're going to run through an expansion event. So one of the expanding farm types that we have is the field crop grain farm. They're expanding in both number and in size. They don't have any livestock. They cultivate cash crops. And they're expanding in all of the census regions that we're looking at. So in this map, we can see a point where all of the field crop grain farm headquarters are in the Stormont-Dundas-Glengarry region, because that we're using census data that's specific to each region. So what we do in a given year is that we select a given farmer for expansion, and so we can see in here that the farm that was selected for expansion is here in this circle. So this is farm ID 15. It's a field crop grain farm, and like all farms that start out in Envision, this is an average sized farm based on the census data. So then what happens is around the boundary of that field crop grain farm, we're conducting a 15-kilometer search. And according to the rules that we developed, a field crop grain farm would prefer to buy a dairy-only farm, a dairy and hay farm, dairy and field crop farm, and it considers these farms equally. And what went into the consideration of what kind of farm a field crop grain farm would buy was the kinds of farming operations that are exiting the market or retiring. And that comes from our analysis of the census data, and how compatible the land on the farm being bought is to the type of operation that's buying it. So you don't want to put a field crop grain farmer on land where it can't plant its cash crops. So in this particular event, the field crop grain farm bought another field crop grain operation, expanding their land holdings from 426 to 538, so it gained about 100 hectares. And after that expansion event occurs, the new fields that it gets are placed in the rotation scheme of their new owner if they weren't the same type as the farm that bought them. So in this case, nothing changed because they were already a field crop grain farm. So, okay, so when do expansion events stop in a given year? So we continue that expansion method for each farm type in each region in each year. And each time an expansion event occurs for a given farm type, we recalculate the average farm size for that type in that region. So for instance, we take in this year, which was, I think it was 2015, we take the total area for all field crop grain farms reporting and we divide it by the total number reporting for that year. And so essentially what we're doing is we're using individual expansion events to try to influence the average size of farms of this type in the region. And why we took this approach is because it was very difficult to tease out of the census data the actual numbers of farms that were expanding in a given year. So in this sense, we're driving the number of expansions by increasing average farm size. And so once we calculate the average farm size, we ask if we've reached or come close to the projected average farm size for that region for that year. And if the answer is yes, then we record the number of expansions that happened, and we move on to the next expanding farm type. And if the answer is in the model, so what we're seeing in this code is the region here, so 1, 2, and 3, each one representing a different census region. And then we see the code for the farm type, so DYO is dairy only. Here we've got field crop grain down here, FCG. And then we have the annual average farm size change per year that we'd expect. And in some of these cases, you're seeing negative numbers because those aren't farms that are expected to increase in size. And then if you look towards the bottom, you see positive numbers. So that's the amount in average farm size for the whole area that we were projecting towards for a given year. And it stays the same every year because it's a linear model. But farms can expand more than once for the same farm, but not in the same year. According to our rules, farms can only experience so what we're seeing farm expanded again, this time buying another field crop grainer operation, bringing its total size to 621 hectares. And then expanded one more time in the year 2028, buying another field crop grain operation, increasing its farm size by another 100 or so hectares. And so it's bought this farm up here. Okay, so there are three mechanisms that we use in the farm model to influence the change in number of farm types over time. The first is through expansion, which we just discussed, and the other two mechanisms are through farm transition and farm retirement. And both of these events are triggered when the expected reduction in the number of a certain farm type isn't achieved or reached through farms being bought up by expanding farms, or whenever we don't see enough farms of a farm that it's expanding in terms of how many it has. So similar to the code we saw earlier, we're looking at average farm size, similar to the average farm size trajectory. This is an example of the farm count trajectories that we code to help determine the number of farm transitions that occur and farm retirements. And so these are actual farm number changes that we would expect to see in a given year. And again, some of them are negative because we're not expecting there to be more of them. In fact, we're expecting these guys to decrease in number. And some of them, like the field crop grain farmers, are expecting more of them. And the nice thing about the way that this was coded was kind of similar to what Scott was talking about earlier, in that we can change all of these values. So if we decided to take a different approach away from the business as usual model, we could adjust all of these numbers so that we get a different kind of model. So retirement is referring to a farm that's made inactive, and that happens by assigning a farm headquarters a -1 or a negative, meaning that it's no longer considered for active events such as expansion. And transition refers to farms that are changing type. So transition really means that when we're trying to reduce the number of a certain farm type or increase the number of another, a farm will change their primary occupation. So for instance, we could see a transition between farms that are fairly similar. So a cow-calf field crop might become a field crop cow-calf farm. And in this example from the farm pivot table, we can see that both of these events occurred on the same farm. So, farm ID 1688 in the year 2011 gets eliminated, so it's retired, and that's because it's a cow-calf farm. So we're seeing a very steep reduction in the number of these farms based on our modeling. But then in 2013, it gets recovered, and not only is it recovered, but now it's a different farm type. Now it is a field crop and other livestock farm, and that's because those farm types were fairly compatible in terms of what kinds of crops or land they have, and also because that we're seeing an uptake in the number of field crop and other livestock farms. So in this last section, we're going to discuss field configuration, but first we're going to look at the geometry of IDUs in a little more depth than was discussed earlier, and how they affect our interpretation of field size, and then we're going to look at what consolidation is of fields and how it works within our model. So before we could consider the consolidation of fields within the farm model, we had to assess whether or not the IDUs as they were originally created were a plausible representation of field configurations. So we're asking is aligned with their real-world counterparts. And usually we don't try to replicate the real world when we're doing future scenario modeling. But because that I was interested in the actual frequency of different field sizes, it was really important to try to start out on the right foot for field sizes. And so the truth is that the IDUs as they were created weren't great representations of real-world fields, and that's because in previous iterations the IDUs were designed more to capture composition rather than configuration, and so we ended up having IDUs that were significantly larger than their real-world counterparts, and that's partially due to the methodology that was used to create the IDUs that can explain why there was this disconnect. So in this first slide we see the AFC crop inventory as it is raw, so it's a raster. And what happens is when the AFC crop inventory is looking at classification, if you have two fields that are identified as the same crop type, they become displayed as one large kind of landmass in the raster, even though they are actually separate fields potentially. And And the AFC crop inventory does identify non-crop land uses, but the problem is because the data tends to be very coarse, some of those actual barriers between fields might not get picked up by the inventory. So the second field's a little wonky because it should have the crop inventory underneath of it, but it doesn't seem to. But anywho, so once the AFC crop inventory becomes vectorized, the IDUs get further subdivided by the cadastre, which are land ownership boundaries. And so that does help to bring the field sizes down a little bit, but not quite enough. So if you could see or imagine, the IDUs very closely match the shapes of the AFC crop inventory where common crop types are, and then just are broken down by the cadastre and then by other layers such as roads and rivers. Okay, so this one works. So that's what that last one should look like. Should look like this guy. And so when you're looking at it from a distance, it doesn't look too bad. Like, that seems believable. But when you look a little bit closer, some of these fields, if they weren't intersected by the cadastre or by roads or rivers, some of these fields would take up an entire cadastre if they had their way. And those are very big field sizes. And so a major concern with using these IDUs if they were unchanged is that they didn't represent plausible field sizes for scenario modeling that begins in 2011, and that they might severely limit the opportunities for consolidation that would happen in the model. So you can see an example of how, oh, I don't know where my mouse is, there it is. You can see an example of how the IDU boundaries don't quite line up with real world fields in here, because you can see these little kind of shadows of lines, and usually those are vegetation that are the berries or fields. There's another one like in here, and there. So what I ended up having to do was to change the configuration of the IDUs or update them, which was essentially just splitting them using semi-permanent landscape features like the municipal drainage ditches, and then by visualizing my own interpretation of field boundaries in ArcMap using the world imagery layer that came from ArcMap. And so this is an example of the IDUs with their updated configuration. So you can see there's more diversity in the number of fields, but also in their shapes and sizes. But there are large patches that that weren't changed because that not all the IDUs that were fields were actually attributed to a farm. So I didn't bother making changes to those because we weren't at the time, or we're not yet using them. Okay. So now that the IDUs are a better representation of fields, we start to look at how we can change the configuration of fields through the consolidation in the farm model. And so consolidation really just means the merging of fields into larger fields, because we expect the number of fields to decrease over time and their size to increase. And what this means is that we're just attempting to model this change by joining or merging fields. So when an expansion event or when a farm is considered for expansion, or when farms change type, field consolidation is triggered on those farms. And that consolidation event occurs each year for 3 years after the event that triggered it. And so we're not actually physically joining fields. All we're doing is assigning a common ID to fields. And the fields that are eligible for consolidation are fields that are planted in the same crop type. So anything in the same color. And those would get assigned a common field ID. And so there's an example of some ones that have been consolidated right here. But there's still fewer consolidated than we expected, and that's an issue that we're trying to iron out. So when they're consolidated, they get placed in the same place in the rotation, and they should just kind of mirror each other through time. And then we use that field ID to look at changes in overall size through time. And so what prevents two fields from consolidating is if they have a distance of more than 0. So if they have any kind of barrier between them, like a municipal drainage ditch or a road or a stream. And we actually added in some additional features like the drainage ditch and like the stream layer, so that we have some fields that just will never join because that there are certain boundaries that would keep them from joining in the real world. So if we look at the same farm 1 year later, we can see that more fields have been consolidated than in the year before. So some more of these farms that are, or fields that are serial, like these guys have joined. These guys were already joined last time. And then in the next year, there are a couple more that have been consolidated. But I thought that I would include this last slide because it's the third year following expansion, so it's last year in which consolidations would occur on this farm. But one of the issues that we didn't anticipate occurring was that sometimes these consolidated fields actually get out of sync. So if any of the events that delay seeding or prevent seeding of a certain crop type happen to one field and not the other, one will continue on in the rotation sequence and one will get planted in what was originally supposed to be planted. And so sometimes they just get out of sync. So we're currently trying to work on a solution where if in a year they're not planted in the same crop type, they try to meet up again in the next year. But that's something that we're currently working on. So to wrap up, that is what we've developed for the farm model. Still ironing out issues, but things are mostly where we'd like them to be. So if anyone has any comments or questions. Yeah.
Use that world imagery.
Yeah.
So you went around and digitized all those things?
Yeah.
That's a lot of work.
It was not ideal. I think, yeah, so if anyone actually was interested in modeling field size, it'd probably be good to either get a lot of people together to help contribute or to find some way of making it automated would be preferable. Yeah.
And then the other layer that went in there was drainage ditch?
Yeah.
And
then a stream layer. Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah.
I think it would be good to, for anybody that might be using this later to try and learn about the system and plan their own thing, to just re-stress explicitly that the whole reason for using the approach that set the same field IDs is because the Envision framework expects these IDUs to be defined right from the beginning. The spatial definition of the IDUs, the geometry starts the same at the beginning and stays that way all the way through, no matter what scenarios you're doing. So this was a way to make two things become as one, even though in the database they stay separate. And then also we realized enables, makes it easy for us to track it through time, because it allows you to see the originally individual parts.
Yep. Yep.
I was just curious about the farm census data.
Yep, sure.
You said two different things. So is it the fact that if you get census data, it's every 4 years it comes out? Every 5? You are able over time to track the change in the amount of farms of a certain kind or not?
Yeah, that's what we tried to do. Yep.
Yes, so you could track fairly simply the eight types.
Yeah.
But then you're also tracking how many of, for example, field crop report having beef cows, as an example. So you start to see differences in those numbers as well. So Tonia went through from 91 to 2011 and went through and tracked those changes.
So farms that are primarily cash crop, so for a given region like Eastern Ontario over that time period, you can track the amount of change, like the reduction in the number of those farms. As well as this other livestock. Okay, so that data does exist.
It is. It's interpreted. The 8 field crop types is data from Stats Canada. The other ones are interpreted by us through the process that I went through this morning.
Okay.
Of how we created the 22 different farm types. So that would be interpreted data rather than Stats Canada data.
Mm-hmm.
But it is the same data that, it's a field crop. In the original 8, it comes out as a field crop farm, and how many of those field crop farms report having dairy cows, beef cows, steers, chickens. So you get a different number over time of how many report all those. So you start to see the differences through time. You can track those trends.
Yeah, the important thing is you are able to establish trends.
Yeah.
And that's what, and it's those trends that you're now using to
Yeah.
project into time. Okay.
Exactly. Yeah.
And Dan, sorry to put you on the spot about this, but I can't remember for sure what you said about how much this is resolved, but can you say something about so there's the original data set that gets you the trends for the 8 types there, and then you could use our logic to interpret the more detailed trends. That data set was custom runs of the census data that Ted Huffman arranged, and that is that the broader data set is going to be available.
Yes, we are in the process of putting it on the. It will be on Open Data Canada,
Great.
so that will be the location of it. There's a subset of it on the website here, but still getting the permissions to put it up onto the data. But it should be
Future censuses could be there too.
Yeah.
That'd be great. Anyone else?